A B-17 ball turret gunner falls 20,000 feet over France with no parachute. The air is too thin to breathe, too cold to feel. He should not survive this. Moments before, he'd been sealed inside the tight glass and steel sphere mounted beneath the bomber, defending it from German fighters of the Luftwaffe. Enemy fire was only part of the danger. The turret had its own ways of failing the man inside it. Alan McGee had already survived that. Now, with the ground closing in, there was nothing left to stop the fall. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, McGee joined the Army Air Forces. Before his 24th birthday, he'd been assigned as a ball turret gunner on a B-17. His station was a steel, aluminum, and plexiglass sphere only 44 inches across that did not retract in flight. It remained fixed beneath the aircraft, hanging in the slipstream, so cramped that the man inside had to conform to the machine rather than the other way around. That design also imposed strict limits on when a gunner could occupy it. The gunner could not be inside for takeoff or landing. The turret sat too low beneath the aircraft, and its guns had to be elevated and locked in a safe position while the bomber was still close to the ground. So every mission began with the gunner waiting for the bomber to reach roughly 9,000 to 10,000 feet, when he would lower himself into the turret. Getting into position was a procedure on its own, and it had to be done in order. First, the turret had to be released and rotated until the hatch aligned with the aircraft's interior. Without this alignment, the gunner could not get inside at all. Next, he hand-cranked the turret into place, opened the hatch, and lowered himself feet first into the compartment. Once inside, his feet went into the footrests on either side of the main sighting window, and the turret forced the rest of his body into a posture that left almost no room to move. As Lester Shrink, a veteran ball turret gunner, put it, quote, "Your knees are almost alongside of your cheeks." Then, his back lay against the curved lower rear section, which also served as his backrest, and the back of his head rested against the closed hatch above him. The position was essentially fetal, forced by the turret's shape. And the gunner had to stay folded like that, working in that posture for hours. McGee had to endure that, day in and day out, and like every ball turret gunner, his mission began with the same basic requirement of fitting the machine. Most ball turret gunners, like him, were relatively small men, usually around 5'5" to 5'7" tall. If a man fit inside, the next problem came with altitude. At around 20 to 25,000 feet, the ball turret was unpressurized and uninsulated, and at operating height, the temperature could fall to around 50 degrees below zero. The gunner dealt with that by wearing layer after layer of heavy clothing. The usual gear included a leather flying suit, fur-lined boots, thick gloves or mittens, and electrically heated clothing underneath. Once inside the turret, he still had to plug that heated suit into a socket in the compartment and connect to the turret's own oxygen supply, a separate system designed to rotate with him without twisting or rupturing. Only after that could he power the turret and bring the sight online. Settling in and connecting everything could take a minute or two, a slow process in a compartment that allowed almost no wasted motion. He then set the gun selector switches and charged the guns using pulley handles near his feet. Even communication was built around that cramped position, as the push-to-talk switch sat by the gunner's foot. If any of those systems failed, exposed skin could freeze in minutes. In at least one documented crew case, on the B-17 Little Miss Mischief, the ball turret gunner survived after the aircraft was badly damaged, but the exposure at high altitude left him with frostbite so severe that he later lost a toe. To make matters worse, there was no room for a parachute inside the turret. The gunner wore the harness, but the chute itself stayed in the fuselage above. Once the bombers crossed into defended airspace, the ball turret became a working combat station. That was the job Alan McGee was doing over France, covering the space beneath the bomber, where attacks could develop quickly and pass through the lower arc in seconds. To do that, the turret carried two 50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in front of the gunner. He controlled the whole assembly through hand grips and foot inputs from inside the compartment. Under normal conditions, the turret could rotate through a full circle in about 8 seconds and move up or down by 90 degrees in about 3. That speed was essential because when a fighter appeared below the formation, the gunner had very little time to respond. The turret could rotate quickly enough that the gunner could lose his sense of direction, especially when the turret pointed downward, and he could no longer see much of the bomber above him. At that point, he had to rely on the internal indicator to determine which way he was facing. The controls themselves were simple. By tilting the hand grips forward, back, or to either side, the gunner could move the turret in the corresponding direction. If both guns were switched on, either thumb trigger could fire them together. The difficulty was using them while enemy fighters were coming in high and diving through the formation at close to 350 miles per hour, while the bomber itself was already moving at around 250 miles per hour. Even with an enemy fighter in sight, it was not just a matter of pointing and firing. The gunner had to work through the spare K4 computing site, which accounted for speed, direction, gravity, and the turret's movement. Early on, ball turret gunners often fired belts in which every 5th round was a tracer, so they could watch their own fire and correct their aim. This created a problem inside the turret, as the brightness of those tracer rounds could flare through the sight, making the reticle harder to see at the exact moment the gunner needed a clear picture of the target. The turret was not completely unprotected. Its seat and lower section included armor, and the gunner's position behind parts of the structure gave some protection against lighter rounds and fragments. It used plexiglass side domes, a steel front section, and an armored lower rear half that also served as the gunner's backrest. In other words, the turret offered more protection than its reputation sometimes suggests. That may help explain why an 8th Air Force survey of returning crews found ball turret gunners accounted for just 6% of crew wounds, the lowest share of any position. Still, that figure came only from bombers that made it home. Statistics from the 95th Bomber Group suggest a harder reality, placing ball turret gunners closer to tail gunners in injury and survivability. The system worked only as long as the aircraft stayed intact and the turret kept responding. If the power failed or the bomber was badly hit, the gunner's problem changed immediately. The same alignment procedure that let him enter the turret now became the only way out. If the mechanism stopped out of position beneath the aircraft, he first had to bring it back by hand. Worse, the hatch opened into the fuselage only when the turret had been brought back into proper alignment with the aircraft's opening, a space defined by a turret ring set into a roughly 46.5-inch hole in the fuselage. If it stopped in the wrong position, the gunner could not simply push his way out. He first had to bring the turret back by hand using the manual cranks, even when the aircraft was under combat damage or shaking, and time was running short. That same geometry made landing emergencies even worse. The guns projected about 36 inches from the turret, more than the bomber's normal ground clearance, which is why the whole assembly had to be elevated and locked for takeoff and landing in the first place. In a wheels-up or belly landing, the aircraft's underside would take the impact, and the turret would be directly in its path, putting the gunner at immediate risk of being crushed inside it. In theory, the turret could be dropped before a crash landing, but it required positioning the turret and disconnecting it from the aircraft systems, a process that could take around 20 minutes. In a combat emergency, that was usually meaningless. Magee's mission would show what happened when that narrow margin finally ran out. On January 3, 1943, Magee was the ball turret gunner on the B-17 Snap Crackle Pop as the bomber force headed for the U-boat base at Saint-Nazaire. As the formation crossed Saint-Nazaire, heavy flak rose into the bombers, and one burst tore into Magee's B-17 over the target area. It was only his 7th combat mission. He was hit inside the compartment and looked down to see shrapnel embedded in his chest. Even so, he got out of the turret, but the bomber was breaking up faster than its crew could get clear of it. When he reached his parachute, he found that it had been torn and was no longer usable. Then the situation worsened again. Another flak hit tore away part of the right wing, and the B-17 went into a spin. Magee was moving from the bomb bay toward the radio room, when at roughly 20,000 feet, He blacked out from lack of oxygen and was thrown clear of the aircraft. He fell more than 4 miles, accelerating to about 120 miles per hour before crashing through the glass roof of the Saint-Nazaire railway station. The roof shattered and appears to have absorbed enough of the impact to keep him alive. Rescuers found him on the station floor with massive injuries. Magee survived with 28 shrapnel wounds, broken bones, serious injuries to his face, damage to his lungs and kidneys, and a right arm that was barely still attached. Out of the 10 men on board, Magee would be the only one who lived. He was taken prisoner, treated by the Germans, and lived long enough to see Saint-Nazaire honor him and his crew with a memorial 50 years later. What made Magee exceptional was that he lived. What put him in that position was far less unusual. That's why, for many who flew in it, the ball turret was not just another station on the aircraft. It was one of the most dangerous places any airman could occupy in the war.